Is it worth the risk to keep on going?
Sure, to win. I mean, that's what we've always done. The money's never been a factor. We raced when we didn't have any.
There are moments in sports history that do not simply mark the end of a career or the closing of a chapter. They mark the end of something much larger, a belief, an era, a feeling of invincibility that an entire culture had built around one singular human being. February 18, 2001, was one of those moments. And for the millions of people who watched the Daytona 500 that afternoon, the world of motorsport would never look, feel, or sound the same again. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was not just a NASCAR driver. He was the sport made flesh. 7 championships. 7-6 Cup Series victories. A nickname, the Intimidator, that was not given to him by a marketing team but earned, lap by lap, bump by bump, through 2 decades of racing that redefined what fearless competition looked like. He drove with a controlled aggression that other drivers spent their entire careers trying to understand and could never quite replicate. He had a way of finding the racing line that seemed to bend the laws of physics around his will. And he did all of it with a quiet, almost casual confidence that made him seem bulletproof. That is the word that matters here. Bulletproof. Because more than any trophy or title, what Dale Earnhardt represented to the millions who followed him was the idea that some people simply could not be broken. He had survived crashes that would have ended lesser careers. He had walked away from fires, rollovers, and collisions that left other drivers shaken for months. He wore danger like a second skin, and it seemed to leave him untouched every single time. So when his black number 3 Chevrolet drifted into the outside wall at turn 4 during the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, nobody panicked. Not at first. Because this was Dale Earnhardt. And Dale Earnhardt always walked away. Except this time, he did not. Within hours, the world learned that the most durable man in NASCAR history had been killed by a crash that, to the naked eye, looked almost routine. No fire. No dramatic tumbling through the air. No explosion of debris across the track. Just a car meeting a wall at a bad angle, sliding to a stop, and going quiet. But behind the silence that followed was a medical reality so sudden and so final that it took an entire sport completely by surprise. And when the autopsy report from the Volusia County Medical Examiner's office was released, the details it contained were not just medically significant. They were heartbreaking in the most profound and specific way possible. Understanding what that report revealed, and what it ultimately meant for the man, his family, and the sport he helped build, is a story that deserves to be told carefully, honestly, and in full. To understand the autopsy findings, you have to first understand the final moments of that race and what Dale Earnhardt was actually doing when the crash occurred. He was not leading the 2001 Daytona 500. He was in 3rd place, and that was entirely by design. Running ahead of him were Michael Waltrip and his own son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., both driving for Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, Earnhardt Sr.'s own team. In the closing laps, Dale Sr. had positioned himself as a kind of human shield, using his car to block the rest of the field and protect his drivers from being overtaken. It was a selfless piece of racing. The man who had won Daytona himself, who had made this track his personal stage, was spending his final moments as a father and a team owner rather than a pure competitor. He was giving the win away, holding back the pack so that someone else could cross the line first. And he was doing it brilliantly, sliding his car across the inside line through turns 3 and 4 to prevent anyone from finding a way around him. Then came contact. Sterling Marlin's car made brief contact with the rear quarter panel of Earnhardt's number 3, the kind of incidental touch that happened countless times during a race at superspeedway speeds. At most other moments in most other races, it would have been a footnote. A tiny adjustment, a corrective steering input, and the race would have continued. But physics does not negotiate. At the speeds involved at Daytona, even the smallest disruption to a car's trajectory can cascade into something catastrophic with almost no time for the driver to respond. Earnhardt's car pushed slightly down the banking, then snapped abruptly up toward the outside wall. Ken Schrader, running beside him, had nowhere to go and the 2 cars collided. The number 3 Chevrolet struck the outside concrete barrier nearly head-on, absorbing a tremendous amount of force in an extremely brief window of time. The car did not catch fire. It did not flip dramatically through the air. It hit the wall, crumpled at the nose, and came to rest. From the grandstands and television cameras, it looked survivable. From inside that cockpit, the forces involved were anything but. Ken Schrader climbed from his own damaged car and ran immediately to the driver's side of the number 3. What he saw in those first few seconds changed his expression in a way that anyone who watched the footage still remembers. He stepped back. He did not wave frantically to medical crews in the way that usually signals urgency. He simply stepped back, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had already understood what the rest of the world would not know for another several hours. He later told reporters that he would not describe what he saw that day. Not out of a desire to protect Dale Earnhardt's image, but because the scene had already told him everything, and there were no words adequate to the moment. Medical personnel reached the car quickly. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was extracted from the wreckage and transported to Halifax Medical Center in Daytona Beach. The medical team that received him worked with the urgency that a situation of this nature demanded, but the injury he had sustained was not one that medicine could reverse. At 5:16 in the afternoon, doctors pronounced Dale Earnhardt Sr. dead. He was 49 years old. The official cause of death, as determined by the Volusia County Medical Examiner and confirmed in the autopsy report, was a basilar skull fracture. This is among the most serious and most rapidly fatal injuries that the human body can sustain. The base of the skull, the area that sits directly above the brainstem, fractured in what medical examiners described as a ring fracture, meaning the break encircled the base of the skull rather than occurring as a single crack or split. This type of injury is almost always caused by sudden, violent deceleration, which is precisely what occurred when the number 3 car struck the wall at Daytona. What a basilar skull fracture does to the human body happens faster than conscious thought. The brainstem, which controls the body's most fundamental functions, breathing, heart rate, consciousness, is compromised almost instantly. There is no period of struggle, no window of awareness. The neurological shutdown is immediate and irreversible. In straightforward terms, Dale Earnhardt Sr. died the moment his head whipped forward and then violently snapped backward during the impact with the wall. The crash took his life before he even knew the crash had happened. There is something about that particular detail that many people find both devastating and, in a strange way, quietly merciful. The man who had spent decades facing danger head-on was not made to endure pain or fear in his final moments. He was simply there, and then he was not. No suffering. No awareness of what was happening. Just the roar of a Daytona crowd, the smell of racing fuel, the rumble of 40+ cars behind him, and then silence. The autopsy report also revealed additional injuries that paint a fuller picture of the physical forces involved in the crash. Dale Earnhardt had sustained blunt force trauma to the chest area, fractured ribs, a broken left ankle, and abrasions and bruising consistent with the restraint system he was wearing. These injuries, while serious, were secondary to the skull fracture and would not have been fatal in isolation. They told the story of a human body subjected to forces of enormous magnitude in an extremely compressed period of time. Among the most discussed elements of the autopsy fallout, both in the immediate aftermath and in the years since, was the question of Dale Earnhardt's seatbelt. Rumors circulated in the days following his death that the lap belt had either torn during impact or had been improperly secured prior to the race. Some witnesses reported seeing evidence that suggested the belt had failed. Others disputed this entirely. Tommy Probst, a rescue worker who was among the first responders to reach the car and who worked to try to save Earnhardt at the scene, stated publicly that the seatbelt was intact and properly secured when he arrived. However, members of the Richard Childress racing team and other observers gave conflicting accounts, and photographs taken at the scene were interpreted differently by different people. NASCAR launched a formal internal investigation specifically into the condition of the seatbelt, examining the belt itself, interviewing safety engineers, and reviewing manufacturing records and similar crash data from comparable incidents. The investigation was thorough, but the uncertainty was never entirely resolved to the satisfaction of everyone involved. What the medical examiner's report did make unambiguously clear, however, was that the basilar skull fracture was the definitive and sole cause of death. Whatever the state of the seatbelt, the head injury alone was sufficient to be fatal, and nothing about the restraint system's condition changed that central fact. The element that NASCAR's internal investigation, and the broader medical community, kept returning to was the absence of a head and neck support device. The HANS device, which stands for Head and Neck Support, had been developed and introduced to motorsport during the 1990s. It worked by anchoring the driver's helmet to the shoulder harness, preventing the head from whipping violently forward and then snapping back during a sudden impact, which is precisely the motion that causes basilar skull fractures. The device had been available to NASCAR drivers for years before the 2001 Daytona 500. It had been used by some drivers in the field that very day. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was not one of them. He had been openly critical of the HANS device, expressing the belief that it restricted the mobility he needed to turn his head and monitor traffic around him at racing speeds. This was not an unusual position among drivers of his generation. Many of the sport's veterans shared similar reservations, arguing that safety equipment which limited a driver's natural range of motion created its own set of risks. The culture of NASCAR at that time was one that celebrated toughness and minimized the acknowledgement of physical vulnerability. Wearing additional safety gear was sometimes seen as a concession to weakness rather than a recognition of reality. The autopsy report made that cultural attitude impossible to maintain. The medical examiner's conclusions, when set against the biomechanics of the crash and the known protective capability of the HANS device, pointed to a conclusion that NASCAR could not look away from. Had Dale Earnhardt been wearing a head and neck support device, the injury that killed him might not have occurred. The violent whiplash motion that fractured the base of his skull was exactly the motion the device was designed to prevent. This was not a matter of speculation. It was a matter of physics, anatomy, and engineering. The black box data retrieved from Dale Earnhardt's car after the crash added further painful detail to the picture. The telemetry showed that in the fractions of a second before and during the impact, Earnhardt's steering inputs essentially stopped. He did not swerve. He did not brake. His feet never touched the pedals in any meaningful way during the collision sequence. This was not because he froze or panicked. It was because the crash developed so rapidly, across such a brief window of time, that there was simply no opportunity to react. The car went from racing at superspeedway speed to striking the wall in a time frame shorter than human reaction time allows for. Dale Earnhardt, with all of his experience and all of his instinct, never had a chance to do anything at all. The crash was over before it could be processed. That detail is one of the saddest in the entire story. Here was a man who had built his reputation on being smarter and faster and more composed in dangerous situations than anyone else on the track. His entire career was defined by an ability to find control in moments when other drivers lost it. And in his final moment, there was nothing for that ability to do. The physics had already made their decision.